Hello everyone, I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and if you have not already done so, please silence your cell phones. Join us next week for History is Lunch when Christopher Winfield and Will Kelly will screen a new documentary film on Canton civil rights activist George Raymond Jr. Looking forward to that. Today, we are delighted to have Deanne Stevens to discuss her new University Press of Mississippi book, The Mississippi Gulf Coast Seafood Industry, A People's History. Deanne Love Stephens is a professor of history and faculty member with University of Southern Mississippi's Center for the Study of the Gulf South. She earned her BS, MS, and PhD from the University of Southern Mississippi. In addition to this new book, she is the author of Plague Among the Magnolias, the 1878 yellow fever epidemic in Mississippi. And last year, she talked to us about that catastrophic viral epidemic for the inaugural episode of the Speaking of Mississippi podcast. So if you have not listened to that, look that up and do so. Help me welcome Deanne Stevens.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thanks, everybody, for coming. One of my loves is Mississippi history of all kinds, and I live in Biloxi. And one of the things that I had probably about 20 years ago, older gentleman, Ellis and Bear, they called him T. He used to talk with me about his life when he came over from Louisiana and became a shrimper. He shrimped on a boat called the Whippoorwill. And I would sit there like probably all of us have sat at the knee of our older generation and listen to him, and I started taking notes. So this work has been literally a work in progress for about 20 years. And many of the people who I was very privileged to become interested in and to learn about their families, sadly some of them have even passed on, but I hope that by going over and writing these down and recording them in this book that the University Press was so gracious to publish, that we've maintained that history and that culture, because it really is a wonderful, wonderful thing down on the coast if you haven't been there. And we're in the middle of shrimp season. So if you happen to get down there, come on, we got fresh shrimp. I'm going to leave up this map for a while as I talk, because one of the things that I wanted to make very clear, if you're not familiar with the area, and I don't know who has been there in the audience, the viewing audience, or who has not, but Biloxi historically literally does sit on a point of land. So let me see if I can get my clicker here, and let me see. The pointer, Chris, is where? Well, there we go. Thank you. So this settlement right here and this settlement right here, this would be Ocean Springs today, and this would be Biloxi. And if you're in the viewing audience, you can see Deer Island clearly delineated here in this old map. And then you see this would be where the Ocean Springs-Biloxi Bridge is right now, and then you come along and this would be Back Bay. And this, of course, is the Mississippi Sound. So if you're viewing at home, you clearly see the Biloxi Peninsula, and then the dark spot on the southern point of that peninsula is what became Biloxi, the city today, and of course it's grown. So when we talk about people who came to create and to work in the seafood industry hasn't always been an industry, but it always has sustained people. We know that Native Americans, Choctaw, and of course the Biloxi and many of the Gula tribes came in. When d'Iberville first landed in 1699, he records in his journal about the wonderful oysters that they found. And of course the French would have been familiar with oysters. So seafood has always been a part of the culture. It has to be. It's surrounded by water, and Biloxi, of course, has expanded into West Biloxi, but what we see with this peninsula was Biloxi at the time. So what we know is that throughout the formation of the Biloxi region and the Gulf Coast region, seafood, fish, and oysters and shrimp always fed the coast, but with the development of schooner trade, sometimes it's referred to as the lake trade, coming through the Biloxi area and the Gulf Coast area going to New Orleans, it did sustain people in New Orleans with various fishmongers that would have sold Gulf Coast shrimp and oysters. So we had a connection with the city of New Orleans, always with the seafood industry. And then the other bookend city that we had a connection with was Mobile. So from the very beginning, with the Gulf Coast of Mississippi sitting between these two cities, there always was a way to market the abundant resources that were in the Mississippi Sound. And it's important to point out, and I'm sure you're aware, but it's the Mississippi Sound that sustained this industry. It won't be until later in the development of the seafood industry that boats will have the capability to go beyond the barrier islands and into the Gulf of Mexico. And of course, the Mississippi Sound, with its abundant marshlands, all of the little inlets and the bayous and the breaks and the rebreaks and the creeks and the rivers and everything that flow into it, was an absolute wonderful natural nursery for the oysters to grow and the shrimp to grow and the fish to grow. So it is a richly blessed land in marine resources. And it's not going to come unto its own until really after the American Civil War. So prior to the Civil War between Mobile and New Orleans, there was some strong trade, but there was also trade in lumber, there was trade in naval stores, shingles were a big item, and even some fruits were being grown prior to. Some of you from the coast might remember post-Civil War, Long Beach was the radish capital of the world. So you've got these wonderful truck farms and things that come along. So trade and commerce is nothing too new to the Mississippi Gulf Coast. But after the Civil War and in the 1870s, when the L&N, the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, finally connected the Gulf Coast with New Orleans and with Mobile, that is the opening then of when the seafood industry will really begin to take off. It was very difficult transporting the marine resources on ships. Oftentimes they would run aground. There was efforts all up and down the coast to make lighthouses for safe commerce travel. That comes after and right before the Biloxi Lighthouse was built in 1848. So you've got, right after the Civil War, those lighthouses still in operation. But not only do you have the railroad, but you had to have another industry develop. And that will come out of the city of New Orleans. That's your ice technology. Until you can ice down those oysters, and I bet there's not a person watching this that has not smelled shrimp shells or oyster shells. Now, they've all told me in Biloxi, honey, it's the smell of money. You know, that's fine. You like that smell, not a problem. But until you can preserve those goods and get them to markets, and with the development of both of those, the railroad and the ice technology, at approximately the same time, that is when we had entrepreneurs up and down the coast begin investing in the seafood industry. So we find that many of the entrepreneurs who developed in the seafood industry were people who came to the Mississippi Gulf Coast after the American Civil War seeking opportunities to develop economically. And that will repeat up and down the coast. And in the book, I looked at operations from Pascagoula all the way on over to Bay St. Louis. So I looked at the 3 coastal counties. Many of the people who invested were people who came in from outside of Mississippi to, again, take advantage of those marine resources. But we find by the 1880s, so the railroad will come in the 1870s. It's just a few years after that when the 1880s entrepreneurs get together, and one of the first seafood factories opened in Biloxi. And William Ducate and Laz Lopez, and both of them are buried still in the Biloxi Cemetery if you get down that way. Someone said they had a 3-day, on Google News, a 3-day thing you could do on the coast. See me afterward. I'll send you to every cemetery and let you see everything there is. But these gentlemen put their monies together, and with a combined of about $8,000, they opened the first seafood factory in Biloxi. And it would have been on the point, and it would have been facing the back bay. So when we're looking at the back bay, we're looking at back here. These are quieter waters. It was at the end of Main Street, and they, of course, would have had access with the boats. They would have come and gone, and they could have then also had access to the railroad that had developed. So from that point, that is really when the coast seafood operation begins to develop on the coast. There were earlier operations. There was the ponds operation over PONS over in Ocean Springs. But on a grand scale, when you're thinking of a business that is going regional and then national, this is when this combines with ice, railroad, and the realization. But one of the things with any industry that the seafood industry has faced throughout, even to 2021, is labor. Who is going to work in the industry? Who's going to harvest the oysters? Who's going to seine the shrimp? Who's going to pick and who's going to shuck? And this was one of the problems that the early industrialists had, was where were they going to find an adequate labor source? The local people up and down the coast had worked from the very beginning in the seafood industry. We find African Americans who worked in the seafood industry. We find African Americans who were captains of ships that went out to harvest oysters. We find local German populations. We find local Irish populations that had come over. So locals always participated in the industry, but there still was such a growing need for a much larger labor pool. So William Ducate in Biloxi decided he would go to the oyster capital of the world, Baltimore. And he would learn the tricks of the trade, and he would find out how is it and who is it that you have laboring in the oyster processing factories. What he found out was that it was Polish people who had come over from Poland. In fact, at the time, Baltimore had one of the largest Polish enclaves outside of Poland. And we found that they worked seasonally in the oyster trade. And when Ducate was there, he decided that he would make arrangements for itinerant annual workers from Baltimore to ride special train cars down. And again, there's always this, when do you harvest oysters? Is it with the months of the R or the without? Locals did it year-round. If you had your own private oyster bed in front of your house, you were going to gather those oysters. But for harvesting for business, they did wait on the R months, which is usually in the winter and the cooler spring, because in the summer, and some of my biologists out here, this is when the oysters are spawning. So you want to let the oysters kind of get good and plump and kind of heavy in the winter months and a little salty, and that is when they were harvested then. So the first workers to come in and begin working outside of the local people were Polish itinerant workers. Now, the living conditions in which they came to was less than ideal. As the factories were getting started, it was really like what we can find in any industry that was developing in the progressive era, 1890s, early 20th century. It was substandard living conditions. They were called seafood camps. They, of course, had no hygienic facilities whatsoever. And oftentimes even there would be one, they called it a beehive oven, where the women would go out and bake their bread. There's wonderful oral histories that I was privileged to get to listen to when some of the older people who remembered the Polish itinerant workers talked. They talked about all the wonderful music that came from the camps when the Polish workers were in. But they also were a little fearful of these workers. They looked different. They talked different, they dressed different. So it was oftentimes with local people up and down the coast that you would have had maybe not a total acceptance, and there was a separation. The workers had the camps in which they lived, they came and they went for the season, and then they left. But when you look at the coast and you examine families who live there now, there are many families whose relatives decided to stay in the Mississippi region as part of the itinerant Polish works from Poland and from Baltimore. The Kopsawa family is one family that I was privileged to get to talk to. And in fact, just 2 or 3 years ago, one of the Kopsawa ancestors from those original itinerant workers, he was crowned the seafood king. We have an annual blessing that just occurred as shrimp season opens. So that heritage still exists. The next, when it was discovered that the itinerant back and forth, that, well, what about the shrimp season? So we just opened shrimp season on June the 10th, had to wait for all the rains to stop and the salinity to go down. Well, the Polish workers were brought in to mostly work in the oyster industry that actually did build the seafood industry on the Gulf Coast in the beginning. Well, you've got these abundant shrimp. So what are we going to do about the shrimp? Well, the next wave of people who come in to work was as a result of international World War I activities with the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the country of Yugoslavia, that of course does not exist anymore and is in today's Croatia, there were many people from Croatia who decided to get out of the turmoil of Europe, and they either came through Ellis Island or they came through the port of New Orleans. And they had heard about, whereas we find in typical patterns of immigrants, men come over, make some money, send it back home, and tell relatives and friends, this is a good place to live. There's opportunity. There had been 1 or 2 Croatian gentlemen who came over. They went ahead and spread the word. They told people that there was a good life here on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And when the international and political turmoil began, many Croatian Yugoslavian people came to the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And I was talking to one of the ladies in the audience earlier, and she was asking about some of the names. And those names, you talk about any name with an ITCH at the end, that's Croatian. And collectively, it's the itch names. And this is Croatian, and they have rebuilt a beautiful, beautiful cultural center that the first one got burned, then the other one got blown away by Katrina, and now they have another. So the Croatian culture, the language, I eat pusheratas every Christmas. And that is a delicacy that was brought over with the Croatian women who made it. They have the various events that occur there. So you have then the Polish culture. Now we have the Croatian culture amalgamating and making this wonderful culture on the coast. And then in the 1920s, we have the Cajun culture coming. There had been a very, very poor sugarcane crop that year. And many French Louisianians came over, familiar with the Gulf Coast, know there's an industry developing, know how to shrimp, know how to harvest oysters, and just move to where you can make a living and feed your family. And we have the Cajun French coming then. And that's where my Mr. Hebert came from. he traces his family back to the French who came over from the Cajun Louisiana area. So you have then a third wave coming in to work in the seafood industry. So we have the original workers, we have the Polish, some who have remained, we have the Croatian, and then we have the Cajun French. And they, of course, bring music, they bring food, they bring religion, they bring all of these wonderful things that makes up the Gulf Coast culture. And one of the things we do on the coast is we eat. We have all those wonderful cultures that made this gumbo of culture that we can enjoy, and we still enjoy in 2021. So during World War II and during the Depression, we find that fishers were often at odds with processors. So the people who went out and gathered the oysters, or who seined for the shrimp, or who caught the fish, they were a separate labor organization. Then they brought their products into processors, and the processors then cleaned and steamed and packed and sent out the product. On the rail, we now have dry ice that is even better, and they're going internationally. You could have found oysters from the Gulf Coast in Chicago, you could have found them in New York City, but they really became a national product during this time. But there was also labor tension. There was a really contentious seafood strike in 1932. And in 1932, there had been several seafood strikes going along through the development of the 20th century, where people who worked on the water were trying to make a living wage for their families and for the work that they did. In 1932, there was a strike. There were some guns fired, there was deaths that occurred, and there also was some racial issues that occurred. One family that I was, again, very privileged to get to speak to was the Ellis family. And Victor Ellis had come in, an African-American man, like other people coming from Louisiana. He had come into the Biloxi area out of Louisiana when he couldn't make a living there. He settled in the segregated part of the city of Biloxi, and eventually he will own 3 boats. And like other boat owners in other cultures, he named one of his boats after his wife, the Malvina. He named another boat after one of his daughters, the Dorothy May. So this was what we see in cultures. There are boats that were named Miss Poland. There were boats that were named, Yugoslavia. So people named their boats, and Victor Ellis did the exact same thing. But in the 1932 strike, because he went fishing for the Marver Company and he broke the strike, he was a wanted man. He was African American, and he was a strikebreaker. So he actually had to go hide in Gulfport with friends because there were mobs and there could have been some very ugly incidents occur. And according to his nephew, whom, again, I was privileged to get to meet, he said he never went anywhere, whether it was on land or water, without a gun after that. So there was not everything that was smooth operation in the development of the coast seafood. The next group that comes in after the 60s, the seafood industry floundered, no pun intended, floundered in the 1960s. In 1950s, and particularly the year 1955, a Supreme Court case had ruled that fisher people could no longer create labor unions as they had tried to do, and of course which Victor Ellis met with. They could not do that because they were independent operators. That movement had come out of California and had ricocheted back to the coast. So now you have independent fishers. You have had for a while, since the 1920s and 30s, you've had those beautiful, beautiful schooners, the bowsprit taken off, motorized, put on, and, chugging along on gasoline engines now instead of the sail power. But in the 50s and 60s, it was tough going after World War II. The market dropped for it. Many of the men went and worked at Ingalls to build boats and other companies, and many found their ways to other parts of the world after they explored in their World War II tours. So we find then that the 60s were tough. Gas prices were high, inflation was running, and who's going to work in the industry? When the Vietnam ended and the fall of Saigon occurred, Richard Gallant had heard about a Vietnamese group of people who were living in Texas. And he went to Texas and he said, almost a repeat of our Polish experience, could you come to Biloxi and work maybe on the weekends in my factory and some of the factories and help out with the labor? So a few families got in his van. He would drive over, pick them up, and bring them back to Biloxi. And this is the introduction then of the Vietnamese into the labor pool of the seafood industry. And of course, they're still an absolute vital part now. And now we have the pho soup that everyone knows, again, adding to our food. We have wonderful Vietnamese French bread that you can buy down on Oak Street on the Point. You have wonderful foods that you can go to, and again, festivals that are now part of the culture of the coast. So the Vietnamese came in the 70s, and then along comes Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Then along came the BP natural disaster in 2010, and what do? Many people who worked in the seafood industry went back to Louisiana. The Vietnamese culture took a particularly hard hit. We find that each immigrant group that came in to work made the Point their home. So it was just a layering on top of a layering of different peoples. And after Katrina in 2005, many had to leave the Biloxi Point to go elsewhere to make a living and feed their families. And then with the BP oil disaster, it was just a double blow. So what we have in today's world going on is we have that a new labor source has come in, and that would be your Hispanic community. So we find that we had an influx of Hispanic cultures from Central and South America after Hurricane Katrina to come in for construction jobs. Well, many decided to stay. Some were itinerant, just like our Polish workers, but some did decide to stay. And we have a large Hispanic population now, but where and who is working? With the original workers, with the Polish workers, with the Croatian workers, with the Cajun workers, with the Vietnamese workers, and now with the Hispanic workers. Absolute, for the most part, gendered lines of labor. We find that it is the men who are out on the boats for the most part. They are the ones who are fishing. They are the ones right now, as we speak, who are out in the Gulf and in the Sound, seining for the shrimp. They are the ones who tong for the oysters or who dredge for the oysters. Then in the processing plants, we find the women and the children. And that has been gendered-specific labor lines from the beginning of the seafood industry. And you had young children working because women in the beginning who went in to pick the shrimp, and that's, of course, taking off the shells, and then to shuck the oysters. Now, the oysters would go through a steam process, but still the women had to use that oyster knife, and they had to pop that open and then get that oyster out, which was very dangerous. So you had women doing that labor, and then of course around them, there's no child care facilities. You would have their young children with them that they would have to bring to the factories. And it's always good to remind ourselves about these factories. If you're working in the shrimp industry, you're working right now. It's like 85, 90, 92 degrees outside, and then add the humidity on, and there's no air conditioning. And then what are you doing with the oyster shells? You're shelling the oysters, you are putting them into a cup for weighing, and you're dropping the shells on the ground. There are many interviews that were done not only about the smell, but about the maggots, about the filth that people were standing in. And sometimes shoes were hard to come by. So they were working in terrible conditions, and then in the winter, when you're working with the oysters, you don't have the heat. There often was one pot-bellied stove, and there's many oral histories that have been done, and the women would bring their their prams, the old-fashioned buggies, or they would put their babies in boxes, and they'd put them around that one pot-bellied stove in the middle to keep them warm as they worked. So within any of the factories, any of the processing plants, you would have had children of all ages scampering about, some working, some not, some as young as 3 trying to peel shrimp, some, Then you would have had the children, the baby children, and you would have had the women. The young boys who had fathers and cousins and uncles and grandfathers would often go out on the boat. So when a young boy was 10, 11, 9, he would then have been accompanying out first on the schooner, then perhaps on a Biloxi lugger that was developed with the oyster industry, or maybe on one of those motorized vehicles that has occurred. And he would have learned the tricks of the trade there, how to best seine, watch the gulls, the currents, things like this. So very specific gendered lines, and we find that even today. We find it even today. You can go into the galat processing, and I'll show you a picture here in a minute, and you're still going to see Vietnamese women and women working within that processing plant for the most part, and then men going out on the boats. So it emulated across the board. It was unique to the Mississippi Gulf Coast, but you had the sardine industry in the West Coast, you had other seafood industries, and when you look across the board, what was occurring in Mississippi was very unique in the fact of the waves of immigrants who came into work. But it was not unique with the labor and the division of labor that was occurring across the board. So the Biloxi seafood industry and the Mississippi Gulf Coast seafood industry has really weathered many storms, not all of which have been created by Mother Nature. And in today's world, of course, you still have fuel prices. In today's world, I talked with the Nguyen family, Nguyen, a Vietnamese family, and they called their grandfather the Steel Hull King. He was some of the first that started developing the steel hull, and of course they now have boats that can go out, and you don't have to worry about ice anymore. The boat actually has freezers on it, and you freeze the catch as soon as it's caught and you come in. Those are the boats that stay out for weeks at a time. And they don't have to come in. They've got enough of their resources there. And I've looked at some of the specs of the boats, and oh my goodness, they have wonderful showers and kitchens, and it's really so much different than what could have been originally 2 people on a boat going out to harvest oysters. But I have a couple of pictures that I wanted to share before we wind up here. So this was just a map here. Let's see. So at the foot of, and you can see him, I took these pictures Sunday night, so you can see the storm clouds rolling in, excuse me. But in order, in the 1980s, to recognize the seafood culture. The city of Biloxi particularly, and it represents the whole Mississippi Gulf Coast, but created the Maritime and Seafood Museum. And they have this is a new golden fisherman statue. The first one got destroyed in Hurricane Katrina. But it's a statue of the man, and you can see, I like the picture because you can see his cast net against the sky. And that's the Ocean Springs Bridge. So as you come across the bridge and you look to your right, you see the museum and you see the golden fisherman welcoming all of the fishermen that has made this culture along the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And then at the base of the statue, families were able to give their family names to the Maritime and Seafood Museum. Robin David is the director there, and that name then was put on plaques. And they're in alphabetical order, and they go completely around. And I wanted to make sure that you saw this because the plaques recommend, and there's my Ellis, Mr. Victor Ellis at the bottom there. And on the plaque, you have Vietnamese names, you have Croatian names, you eventually are going to have Hispanic names with the advent of their coming into the industry now. But you have French names, you have many different names that are represented as part of the culture of the Gulf Coast. So Victor Ellis is down there on the bottom, and then we have Crystal Seas Seafood. So this seafood processing plant is in Pass Christian. And it sits back on one of the bayous in Pass Christian. And if you're ever on the coast, you can go to this particular plant and you can buy a half a sack of oysters, you can buy a full sack of oysters, or you can buy oysters that have already been shucked for you. It's kind of fun to try it. But this is the only seafood plant that still does it by hand with oyster knives. And they do quite a wonderful business. This was a family who came in from Virginia. They had dealt with the vivax problem in Virginia, a little organism that gets in and destroys the oysters, and they came down to the Gulf Coast, again, seeking a livelihood, as we've seen so many of the immigrants come. And here we have this wonderful family coming in, creating Crystal Seas. This is a pile of oysters. I got pretty close for you here. But I wanted you to know that in the past, you could have seen piles of oyster shells or oyster shells on every road. You could have smelled them before you saw them. And this would have been what would have been a common scene. Some of you might collect postcards, and there's many old postcards of big, giant shells of oysters. Well, there's very few of those left now. But this is in the back of Crystal Seas, and it's really mountainous, and you can barely make out in the back that there's like a road that goes up for a truck. Because what is done now with the oyster shells is grit for chickens, Chris. You can make it and do it for other things, and we still use it as part of the processing. There's even, there was an architectural element in the early 20th and late 19th century. You can still see examples of it on the coast where they would have put oyster shells onto blocks for building, and it gives it a very bumpy look. But every once in a while, you'll see an old house that still uses it. So no part of the oyster was wasted then, and no part is wasted now. So this is at Crystal Seas in Pass Christian. Then here's Galatz. Someone in the audience mentioned that they were going to be on the coast and they were going to be staying at the Pearl Casino in d'Iberville. Well, this is adjacent to it. Galatz is a family of French heritage. They came not from Louisiana, but from Alabama. During the time when French were coming into the Gulf Coast, not only were they coming in from Louisiana for the majority, but we also had several families coming over from the area of Bayou La Batre. Fishing was good over on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. They could make a living, and they actually put family on the schooner, sailed over. Wonderful family pictures exist, and then set up housekeeping, and the Galatz was one of them. C.F. Galat started this years ago, and his first claim to fame was and Miss Martha Hudson will appreciate that, he could bring oysters all the way to Hattiesburg. So yeah, it was quite a distance to go. So Galatz is down there, and again, processing plant. You can see some of the original Vietnamese women in here working, and I talked with Arnie Galat, and he said they have a place of honor as long as they want. So again, this is behind Galatz. That is the Biloxi Back Bay Bridge. Just, you can go and take pictures. You can go see the beautiful shrimp boats that come in, and they really are absolutely gorgeous. And most of the harbors, whether you're at Bay St. Louis or I think Pass Christian Harbor is such a beautiful harbor, and over to Ocean Springs and Pascagoula and Gaucher, you can find shrimp boats coming in and out, dropping off their catch. And this again, just a shrimp boat picture, just to show you this is in the Biloxi Harbor. And that's it. So the seafood industry, come sample, come learn, and come enjoy. Thank you so much.
Deanne, when you were kind enough to do your History's Lunch program last year, you had to do it to a mostly empty auditorium, and we couldn't take questions, but I'm happy to say that today we can. If you have any questions for Deanne, now's the time to ask them. Raise your hand, I'll bring the microphone around. Charlie?
I wanted to ask you about the state of the fisheries now for shellfish. I know we've had the floods on the Mississippi where they opened up, the Bonnie Carey spillway, and it gets too much fresh water in the sound. And biologically, or what is the state of the fisheries now?
It's hurting. Pass Christian historically had one of the largest oyster reefs, in fact, right off its beautiful harbor. And oysters were, again, built that industry in Pass Christian. Governor Phil Bryant, when he was a governor of Mississippi, he created a committee and an investigation group to look into what can be done to salvage this. Mississippi has dealt from the very beginning passing laws, how to protect the industry. The Bowers Oyster Bill in the early 20th century even talked to the point about, how much dredging could be done, because they realized when the tongs, I think you probably know what I mean with tongs. They kind of look like chopsticks, and it takes a lot of strength to work them. They're very long, and they scoop up. But when you start dragging a dredge over the oyster beds, it really creates some problems. So there has been recent movements about what to do. Some of what happens with the oyster product is the shells are taken back out to where historic oyster beds have been, and they're dumped to make, I call them apartment houses for the oysters. They give them beds to work on. When I showed you the picture of Galatz, there's an oyster reef right outside of Galatz, and it opened for the first time, well, not during COVID, but pre-COVID that year, for the first time in years. So there is some good work going on in trying to legislate protection, add to the oyster beds, but there's also some work going on, and the University of Southern Mississippi is working with growing oysters. Just as we have oyster farms and other farms, Southern is doing that. And one of my colleagues, and she's in the book, Dr. Anita Arguelles, she calls herself an oyster farmer. And she and her husband go out, and USM grows the little baby oysters, the little spates, and then they have special cages they put them in, and she says she has to go out and turn them and make sure that they get, the proper everything. But they hang rather than bottom. So, and that industry is working well. So there's oysters that are being grown, there's restoration of oysters reefs, there's monies that is coming in through the BP to try to save oyster reefs. They very, very carefully monitor how many licenses are given and what bags you can come off, and it's a hefty fine if you don't follow it. So short of what can be done, but when that Bonnie Carey spillway is open, fresh water kills it all. And the oyster farms on Deer Island, when the Bonnie Carey first opened 2 years ago, all this is pre-COVID, all the little baby oysters died. They just can't survive in fresh water. So there's a lot that could be done, but there's a lot being done. Thank you for the question.
Could you comment on the effect of the casino industry over the last, 35 years? I mean, I do know that there's casinos athwart both Bayou Caddy in Hancock County, and Point Cadet was entirely wiped out. So can you comment on or talk about what you know about that?
Yes, the question was, if you didn't hear it, what impact has the casino industry had on the fishing industry in and along the entire Gulf Coast? One of the things that we found was that the fishing fleets were displaced. So whereas previous to casinos, which came in 1992, previous to casinos, you would have driven along Highway 90 and you would have seen on your right or your left-hand side all the restaurants and the hotels and everything, and on your left-hand side you would have just gone from one after another of processing plants and where people parked, where they got ice, and all about the boats. That doesn't exist anymore. It doesn't exist, and it particularly doesn't exist now. Post-Katrina, casinos can now go south of Highway 90. So they breached Highway 90. So the casino industry has brought many job opportunities, but it also has been a compromise for the fishing industry. So oftentimes cities have created new docking facilities. Where are you going to gas your boat? Where are you going to get the ice for your boat if you don't have one of the big steel hulls to go out to the Gulf? All of that had to be worked out, and there is advocacy to make sure that this industry does not disappear, and casinos work with that, but at the same time, trying to work side by side. Sometimes we find more. For example, Biloxi has its shrimping feet mostly now on the back bay. You can go to the back bay, where it used to be all along, but now there's casino. Yes, so it's been displaced to a certain degree. Yes, ma'am.
Comment about how the name Cajun came to be, where they came from, where that name came from, and I know the current status because I know a bunch of them, but
Yeah.
I don't know where they came from and how come they call Cajuns.
Well, it's a corruption of the name Acadia, and the Acadian French were displaced by the French, and many years ago, and they had to evangelize. Poetry is beautiful about that. They had to find a place to live because they were kicked out of Acadia, Nova Scotia area. So they went down to Louisiana because the French held Louisiana at the time. So we're way back into the 19th century here, way back. And the name Acadian just got corrupted over the years to become Cajun. So you still refer to it as Cajun French. It's a mixture. It's a good French, and one of the things that you'll still hear around the Gulf Coast, or you'll hear Cajun words. If you go down to the blessing of the fleet, after the blessing, there's a fais dodo. That is, again, a French word. So that is part of the culture. So when they settled in Louisiana and they settled where they couldn't be found by the English into the swamps, they eventually became the Cajuns. And then when things happened in the 20th century then, in regards to this industry, they just moved over from their water world into Mississippi's water world. I think that answers. Good. You're welcome.
Could you talk a little bit about the development and the importance of the Biloxi Schooner boat?
Well, the Biloxi Schooner is a beautiful boat. There's 2 replicas that the Maritime and Seafood Museum owns that you can go on schooner rides, one of those 3-day trips we've been talking about. You can go out and do that. But the Biloxi Schooner was developed specifically for the waters of the Mississippi Sound. They're much more shallow waters, and the schooner then at sail power would have dragged the seine nets, and then during oyster season, you would have had 2 or 3 smaller boats with 2-man crews that would have gone out from the schooner. So she is making a comeback. People are recognizing there's wonderful wooden boat shows that go on up and down the coast if you're interested in that. But the Biloxi Schooner, as far as the schooner itself, when gasoline-powered engines came and sail power was replaced by gasoline, that is when the schooners stopped being made. And they were replaced by the Biloxi lugger, which was developed also for shallow coastal waters, and that lugger then could go out and help with the harvesting of the oysters, and the beautiful line of this gorgeous schooner with sails furled, that didn't occur. They used to have schooner races, all of the various companies, the processing companies. So in the beginning of the industry, the individual fishers owned their own boats. I mentioned Mr. Ellis named one after his mother and one after his daughter. Eventually then what happens is the boats become so expensive, and I talked with the Marver family who built their processing plant, that the boat, and Miss Marver saved for the boat, out of her pin money, as it was called, and it was about $1,800 in the 1900s, and they built the boat. Those boats then eventually were replaced with gasoline engines, and now, of course, it's steel hull. If you go over to Bayou La Batre or you come down to the coast and you look, a lot of them are steel hulled. What we just saw were steel hulled. Does that answer your question, sir? Good.
I want to ask you about the immigrant groups again. Could you kind of give us a sense of which groups, the Polish, the Italians, the Sicilians, and the other groups that you mentioned, are there more of one than another? What percentage of the population are they, if you have a sense of that?
There are probably, in today's world, there probably are descendants of your Croatian and your French, the majority. Because the Polish came in as itinerant workers, they didn't come specifically to make the coast their home. Your Cajuns came specifically to make the coast their home. Croatians, Yugoslavians, same thing, specifically to make the coast their home, where the Polish came back and forth. So the Vietnamese at one time probably would have, I would have said the 3 of those. But since Hurricane Katrina on the coast, up and down the coast, there's been a large loss of Vietnamese population. So I would go, it's a good question, I would go your Croatian, your Cajun French, your Vietnamese. Yes, sir.
I always thought there were a number of Italians.
There were some Italians, there were some. They weren't necessarily, however, involved in the seafood industry or in the ownership of the processing plant. You also had a large German population. You had a very large Greek population, but nothing to equal what we had with the other immigrants. The Greek population has a wonderful pastry sale every Christmas. So we still have, I'm all about the food. We still have that wonderful food, that comes in. But no, there were many nationalities. There were, other Portuguese that were represented. But the main workers in the seafood and the owners were whom I've spoken of.
Would you comment on the other aspects of the immigrant life, religion, education, that kind of thing?
Well, luckily for many of the immigrants who came in dealing with spirituality, they were Catholic. And the coast had a very strong Catholic population going back to the French settlement from 1699 on. So whereas maybe you wouldn't find as much of the Catholic faith in other parts of Mississippi, on the coast it was the predominant faith of the people at the time. So they were able to go, and in fact, on the Point area, so where that dark spot was that I pointed out that was basically Biloxi at the beginning, on the very point, the fishermen got together, and it's still referred to as the Fisherman's Church, and it's St. Michael's, and all of the blessing of the fleet events and things just occurred there 2 weeks ago. But they actually, throughout the point, this would have been your Yugoslavian, this would have been your Cajun French, and others collected money and enough money to build that church. The original church in Biloxi, Nativity, was down on Howard, and there actually would have an itinerant priest, but the immigrants themselves thought they needed a church there. So it was rather a seamless entry into the religious world. Education-wise, it was tough. There were several schools that were constructed for immigrant children, and those schools, and immigrant adults, those schools offered classes on Saturdays and even Sunday evenings, because oftentimes, whatever time you listened for your factory. So if all of us in here were working for the Barataria factory, well, the Barataria, when the boats came in, like we saw, laden with the oysters or filled with shrimp, that factory had a distinctive whistle. And we would be laying in bed at 2 or 3 in the morning, and that whistle would blare, and it would go across the point. And we all would know then that that's our work. And we would get up out of bed, we'd get the babies up, we'd go down, we'd maybe make some hot coffee, we'd walk down, push the baby tram, and we would start going to that factory, and the men would start unloading, and they would have unloaded that, and the women would start going into the factory and shucking the oysters or peeling the shrimp. So it was an absolute difficult schedule to have a school year that, or school time. So it was catch can, catch may. Money-wise, oftentimes as workers, you were not paid in currency. There was something called the shrimp nickel and tokens that you would have been paid. But we see that across the board. Whether you were mining in Appalachia or you were doing other work, oftentimes you weren't paid in script. You were paid in tokens that represented. And in the beginning, each factory would have its own token. So if we ladies in here picked our 5 pounds of shrimp and went up to get our pay, we would have gotten a brass disc, and that would have represented our 5 pounds. And then we would have been honored. And again, just like with from coal miners on, there were company stores. And we know those company stores had special prices. And they took those shrimp nickels. So that was another problem that was encountered. So the immigrant's life, it was not a seamless entry into society in the Gulf Coast region. They often lived in separate areas. Now, our original African American workers, they were living in segregated neighborhoods. They lived with a city within a city, in every city up and down the coast. So they were not welcome racially. Ethnically, there was prejudice shown to some. Sometimes you'll see the word Bohemian referring to your Polish and your Croatian workers, just kind of as a catch-all, different person. So there was prejudice shown. Education was not a priority for most part. Some of the Catholic outreach did try to educate, and again, schools may be in someone's home.
I know there are a few more questions, but we have come to the top of another hour, and I bet Deanne Stevens will be good enough to answer those questions for you in line over here where we have copies of her book for sale. Thank you all for being here. I hope that we see you
Thank you.
next week. Help me thank Deanne for this program today.
Thank you very much.